Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Open Source in Business. In this series, we've been shining a light on various aspects of open source that don't usually get a lot of attention as they relate to the business world. And this week, I'm joined by John Lilly. He worked for the Mozilla Corporation from 2005 to the end of 2010, 3 of those years as CEO. And from 2011 to 2019, he was a partner with Greylock Partners, a venture capital fund based in the Silicon Valley. Thank you for joining me, John.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
It's my pleasure. So today we're going to talk about the impact that Mozilla had on the internet through the decade, really from 2004, 2003 through to 2015, 2016. And I guess to get us started, can you tell us what you're up to now? Because you're no longer at Greylock.
Sure. I stopped investing. I'm still associated with Greylock, so I still sit on boards for Greylock. So I'm on boards of companies like Figma, which redoing design, and Neuro, which is a robotics company, and Caffeine, which is a live streaming company, and a few others. So I've got a few boards for Greylock, and then I spend as much time as I can. Well, as much time as I can on nonprofit and mission-oriented things around how we govern and how we run elections. So on board chair at something called Code for America, which is trying to figure out how to help local and state governments use technology to provide better services, digital services to citizens and residents. And then a company called Voting Works, which we may talk about, which I was involved with getting started a few years ago. And then I've got an 8-year-old and a 14-year-old. I'm trying to keep them in school during COVID. So that takes more time than it sounds like, but all parents watching will recognize that.
I know what that's all about. Yeah. I'm very interested in Voting Works, and I definitely want to come back to it. I guess this is a busy week for you. Do you have any voting machines that are going to be counting elections next week?
Yeah. My friend named Ben Adida, who's worked with me at Mozilla, and he has his PhD in election security. He started a company maybe 2 years and change ago, and we were pretty worried about the security of our voting infrastructure, I think for obvious reasons at this point. And so we started building voting machines that were open source, trying to build sort of the Firefox of voting machines at some level. And we are running elections, and we're doing a few things. We're running some absentee ballots in some states. So both the creation of the absentee ballots and the counting of them. We're running accessible voting in a number of states. And then we are running audits, post-election audits in, I think, half a dozen or 8 states to try to figure out which states need recounts and which won't. So they're called risk limiting audits, RLAs. And so that's going to be an unfortunately important part of this election, I think.
Okay. So what's involved in a risk limiting audit? Do you sample the ballots, make sure the count is correct? And
yeah, it's something like that. And I think that there were 0 states that did it in 2016, or maybe just Colorado. Now this year, I think it'll be Colorado plus the 6 or 7 states that we're doing. But yeah, it's that we really believe you need paper ballots, and you need to be able to see for an audit trail. And so you run the risk limiting audit software called Arlo. It says pull this ballot, let's check it. If they all check out within a certain confidence interval, then you don't need to pull more ballots. If they don't check out, you need to pull a few more and check again.
Okay.
So you get increasing confidence over certain rounds. So we'll see. It's going to be interesting to see both how the process works in fairly stressed situations, and then how the reporting works on it. So how people come to understand what's happening after the election day.
Sounds like a fascinating potential real world implication of like Deming's work around quality assurance and sampling. No?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actual statistics we need to do, and then helping people understand quality and understand how to think about statistics, and which, I'm not sure Americans are totally, I'm not sure we've been educated in the right way to really understand what we're saying.
As borne out by a lot of people overestimating what a 30% chance of winning means from years ago.
Yeah, underestimating. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But getting back to Mozilla, the core of our conversation today. So a little bit of history. The Mozilla project was created by Netscape, open sourced in 1998, 99.
Yeah, that's right. And the guy, I mean, that's a good story by itself. Like, there's a guy named Bob Lisbon, who's the GM of Netscape back then, and because of Microsoft launching IE, I mean, back then, you paid money for a browser every year. And when Microsoft launched it for free, sort of bundled with the operating system, which obviously would lead to the antitrust stuff later, that forced Netscape's hand, forced Netscape to put it to free as well. And then there was this project inside Mozilla, inside Netscape, what happened is that the story Bob tells is that he was up late one night and he started looking at the about boxes for the pieces of software from Microsoft that Netscape was competing with. He started counting all the names of all the contributors, because that was back when all the contributors were listed. And he got to like 2,600 names or something like that. And Netscape, the browser project, had 200 total. And he just realized it was going to be impossible for Netscape ever to compete symmetrically with Microsoft. And so he, and along with Mitchell and Brendan, they started hatching this plan, looking at Linux, to try to figure out, like, well, how can we make an open source browser? Maybe that's the right way to compete in an asymmetric way with Microsoft. And I think when Bob tells the story, he says that, convincing Barksdale to give the thing away for free, that was the hard one. Once it was free, Barksdale didn't much care whether it was open source or not. And so that's when internal to Netscape, the Mozilla open source project started in parallel with the Netscape browser. That's why Mozilla is called Mozilla, because the Netscape mascot was a dinosaur named Mozilla.
I thought it was called Mozilla because it was the mosaic killer.
Nope. Oh, maybe. I mean, I don't know, actually. But that would be the dinosaur. The Mozilla project's named after the dinosaur that was the Netscape mascot. And I don't know what the dinosaur was named after.
Okay. What role did Jamie Zawinski have to play in the open sourcing? My memory is he was one of the primary proponents of it inside Netscape.
Yeah, I've never met Jamie. So, I mean, he's obviously had a huge outsized impact on Mozilla over the years, and everybody at Mozilla was connected to him somehow. But I got there in 2005, which was well after he had moved on. So I've never actually don't know.
Okay. Do you think the open sourcing of Mozilla at the time was like a what have we got to lose play, or was there actually conscious strategy behind, we're going to open source the browser that will enable us to, maintain market share in the server market, or what was the thinking behind it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You have to really go back to talk to Mitchell and Brendan and Bob. But I think it was probably a combination. I think that some people could see. I mean, my sense is that from Bob's point of view, the GM's point of view, from a business standpoint, it was like, what have we got to lose? Like, it might work. And I think that point of view was borne out for a long time, because Mozilla really wandered around in the wilderness for years after that.
Yeah,
to be relevant. But I do think that there's some people who looked at Linux and they said, especially nerds, like technology. I mean, this will be a common thread. But like, you looked at Linux, you say, man, that's the future. That's changing the world, and everything's going to go that way. And so I think that you got people like Mitchell and Brendan who looked at this and said, oh, this is the way. And so I think that there were people who some people was like, what do we got to lose? Some people say, well, this will be the future, and we can go change the world this way.
Okay. So Netscape then got acquired by AOL. And in 2004, AOL decided to spin off Mozilla essentially as a separate nonprofit entity, the Mozilla Foundation. And fund
2003. And it was a weird winding road. The kind of Netscape, parts of it went into Sun for a little while, and then AOL. And by the time 2003 came around, AOL had maybe 5 or 6 different browser projects. Remember, there was a multi-renderer engine where they had IE's render and Gecko in it, and there was the AOL browser, and on and on and on. And there was this little group inside AOL, again, helmed by Mitchell Baker and Brendan Ike, and they were working on Mozilla Suite, which was email and the browser and an HTML editor, because all these things were kind of like considered like you had to put them all together to have a compelling consumer project. And so none of the original Netscape people inside AOL loved working there, but they all loved working on Mozilla. And so thanks to Mitch Kapor, the founder of Lotus, and eventually founder of EFF. He was close to some of the AOL leadership. He helped Mitchell and Brendan convince AOL to let it go, and to get them to trademark to the word, trademarks to Mozilla and the source code and some of the office furniture and a few bucks to fund themselves. But that was it. It wasn't much more than that.
I remember Joel Spolsky blog post from, I guess, maybe 2001, 2002, where he talked about one of the biggest strategic mistakes that Mozilla made was deciding to rewrite the engine, the core engine, after open sourcing. Was that an opinion shared by the Mozilla team at the time, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I doubt they took Joel's analysis as gospel for that, just because I think that when you get on the inside, especially browser engineers and render engineers are it's an unusual set of people. It's a little bit like operating system engineers. I mean, for what it's worth, and so I think that you don't really rewrite a browser engine because you're pretty sure you need it. And Brendan, Brendan's been building JavaScript since 1995, and so he's not one to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think that maybe Joel was right, but I don't think so. I think that Gecko has its problems, but it was a really robust engine for a long, long time. So I don't think anybody was unhappy about having rewritten it. I mean, I think the real shooting started when before I got there still, 2003, 2004, when some people internal to the Mozilla project said, people don't need an email bundle with their browser, and people don't need an HTML editor. What they really want is a fast browser. We'll call it, Phoenix. And eventually that would become Firefox. But that was a really radical idea. And it was not so much about the back-end technology as it was about what packaging the consumer wanted.
And that was Blake Ross and Ben
Goodger, yeah.
Yeah.
But look, there were a lot of people involved in that decision, and there's a lot of apocryphal stories about who was against it, who was for it. It was a complicated decision, but the truth is, once a simple, fast browser came out with Phoenix, maybe 0.5, 0.6, people really loved it, and it was became really obvious that's what the market wanted.
Well, I recall the zeitgeist around that time was that there was heavy institutional investment in Mozilla Communicator as the suite, as the kind of the main thing that Mozilla was going to work on, and that the early versions of Phoenix, what became Firefox, were essentially a skunkworks project that people did almost, behind the veil without letting people know until it got to a point where they were ready to show it. Is that how it happened in reality, or was it an actual conscious decision to do a lightweight browser?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty conscious decision, but it doesn't mean it was a unanimously held conscious decision. So I think that it was a project that people set out on. But I do think that's an interesting point, which is that open source projects, they have a tendency to kill new things, because when you've got any new idea, when you've got this default open, you share this brand new idea, and new ideas are like little hothouse flowers. Like if you look at them wrong, they wilt. And so I think that most projects that are successful, they have enough heft to withstand some of the stop energy, but are still clearly not finished. And so that's anyway. So I think that's sort of the essence of how to do things in open.
So going back to the moment where Mozilla Foundation spun off AOL. At that time, I remember thinking it was a couple of $1 million, I believe, was the initial funding from AOL for Mozilla Foundation. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking that you were going to have a really tough time building a business proposal. At the time, I think white labeling Mozilla Communicator for various companies was the main business model. Was that a difficult time? How did you happen on the revenue model that ended up being?
Yeah, well, again, this predates me. So if the timing was 2003, something like that, 2004, and I think that's true that it was not clear what the Mozilla business model was going to be. I was around the project, but I was not inside the project. My involvement sort of started because I was involved with another open source project started by Mitch Kapor called the Open Source Application Foundation. He was trying to build something called Chandler, or he did build something called Chandler with his team. And that was supposed to be like a new version of Agenda from the Lotus days, so like a note-taking, collaborative note-taking tool. And that didn't really work, but it was interesting because, and I think it shows you, it's one indicator of how unlikely Mozilla was to succeed, is that there was a book called Dreaming in Code by, I think, Scott Rosenberg. And he came out and hung out in the office of Mitch's offices for Open Source Application Foundation were on Howard Street in San Francisco. And he gave office space to Mitchell and the Mozilla folks. And so eventually Mitchell and I were on the board, and Tim Riley were on the board of that. And Scott wrote this book about open source code. And his conclusion was, man, the software is really hard. Big software projects will never work. And it's because he was looking at Chandler and he was ignoring this other thing that was in the building, Mozilla, because Mozilla didn't seem very interesting, whereas Chandler seemed exciting. And it just goes to show you that Mozilla didn't know their business model. It wasn't clear they were going to build something that people loved. There was a lot that was uncertain and non-obvious to like even pretty informed observers at the time.
I think I remember Chandler. I even remember trying it out at one point. And I remember thinking that it was building a huge piece of software almost monolithically. It wasn't really usable until it was finished. Mm-hmm. Whereas Mozilla was starting from an existing user base. And as you said, when Firefox came out, or the early releases of Phoenix came out, people really loved it because it was exactly what they were looking for. So do you I guess thinking of a question, the early success of Firefox, what drove that early success? What was the aspect of, the Firefox user base that attracted it to?
Sure.
Well, those early versions were still a little rough around the edges sometimes.
Well, yeah. So a couple of things. So, I mean, I think there's a number of answers to that question. But I would say that even then, it was not totally clear how to make open source really sing for consumers. And Linux had looked like it was succeeding. There's some other open source projects, but there have been no big consumer breakthroughs. And I think in retrospect, if you look at consumer open source, what consumer open source is best at is like taking an existing product and making it like suck 30% less. And so it's like we took a browser and we made it suck less than the other browser did. What it's not as good at is, how do you create something new from whole cloth? Because it's a different type of thinking and different type of problem. But I would say that you go back to Phoenix and Firebird and eventually Firefox in 2004, especially. 2004 was the pivotal year because Microsoft and Internet Explorer had gone and disbanded most of the IE group. They had figured they had finally, put a bullet in the web, and they had sent a lot of those guys off to work on Silverlight, which was their Flash competitor at the time. But a couple of things happened. So number one is just from a consumer standpoint, the experience still was crap, which would be, and only old people will remember this, but like you go into the office every day on your Windows laptop and you code. And then you get ready to go home and you'd have to start closing all the pop-under windows that had popped up with ads all day. And you'd have, literally you'd have between 100 and 200 during the day. It was just a huge, awful experience. And then the second thing is that Mozilla, I don't think was the first to implement tabs browsing, but people really liked tabs in the browser because it started to help you consolidate some of the windows that you'd collect as you worked on a project or during the day. And then the third thing is a US CERT, the security organization, issued a security warning and said, hey, look, IE is not always secure. At a minimum, you should have a separate browser like Firefox on your desktop. And so that drove a lot of adoption. And then, they eventually launched Firefox 1.0 in November of 2004. And they had something like 10 million downloads that first month, and that was quite a large number for any project like this. I mean, it was largest by a long stretch.
Wasn't that the release where they did the full page New York Times ad? Was that 1.0?
Yeah, 1.0. 1.0 had a couple of things that were notable. One is that obviously it had, 0.9, they've integrated search prior to that. So Google and Yahoo, with Google as the default search engine, had come in a few releases before that. But you're right. To announce the project, they were going to take out a one-page Firefox ad, and so they crowdsourced it back before crowdsourcing was much of a thing. And they basically said, look, if you give us $10 or $100, whatever it is, whatever the number is, we'll buy this ad and we'll have everybody's name, and it sort of builds the picture of Firefox in the New York Times. And it was so successful, they ended up taking 2 pages out in the New York Times. And obviously that was kind of characteristic of the way that Mozilla Press, and I credit a lot of this to Chris Beard, who would eventually become the CEO. I worked with his head of marketing for a long time, but he always would find ways to do marketing and press where the press itself was interesting, but the way they did it also generated process stories. And so he always had double or triple bangs in the way he did press. He's just a really genuinely talented marketer.
And it was amazing, like leveraging the Firefox community and this enthusiastic user base as a way to fund. That was just, I remember that gave me the warm and fuzzies back in the day. Yeah. So your early audience was kind of built primarily on, as you've hinted at, momentum users, geeks, hardware like internet developers. So how important was that early momentum in internet developers for your consumer success later on?
Yeah, it was everything. It was really everything. And if you think about Firefox is a good, fast browser with no pop-ups and tab browsing and integrated search. So that was all, and it's secure. And so that was all a pretty big deal. But what really helped developers love it was the extensions like Firebug and Firebug. What's that?
And the DOM connector, JavaScript debugger.
That's right. So tools really for building what would become Web 2.0. This is right at the beginning of Gmail. And so Gmail was the first app that was in a browser. You're like, oh, maybe you can put genuine applications in a browser instead of just web pages. But it was a huge pain in the ass to code. And so you needed debuggers and inspectors and that kind of stuff. And Firefoxes blew away what you could do with Internet Explorer. And so developers started building interesting web apps on Firefox. And so a couple of things happened then, is that we started getting natural adoption, and then we started getting adoption from developers. And then because unmanaged computers were the norm then, as opposed to what we have now with Android and iOS, like developers who were doing support for their families and their libraries and their schools, they would say, well, I'd rather support Firefox on this than IE. And so you had this explosion of people, nerds, doing installs of Firefox on every machine they ever touched. And so that kind of like was a virtuous cycle. And then, we get into the 4, 5, 6% market share range, which is not usually enough to move things, but because the developers were doing the development of web apps on Firefox, it meant they tested on Firefox. And so once we got to 7 or 8% as a default, like almost every application being written on the web was being written in Firefox. And that meant that it tended to work better in Firefox than it did in IE. And that became a self-perpetuating cycle. And so after we got to, this is about when I got there, maybe 4 or 5%, like we were quickly to 8 or 9%. And by the time we got to 8 or 9%, it felt like we were going to be a fixture for a very, very long time. That was in 2005.
So do you remember, did you have stats on plugins and extensions and themes? How important were things like themes for Firefox to adoption? What was the median number of extensions that people had? Did people have anything more than just Adblock?
Yeah, people had a lot of extensions. And in fact, I don't know about themes. Themes are interesting, but the extensions actually caused a big problem for us over time because they were basically privileged pieces of code that ran in the browser, and you couldn't, because we didn't have tab separation or memory process separation between tabs, for example. So if you had something running in a tab that would took down the browser, it would take the whole browser. Extensions tended to leak memory because they were trusted. And so this whole combination made it quite hard to actually understand what's happening in the wild a lot of times. And 2007, 2008 was a tough year for us, and because of the rise, it's when we started getting a reputation for being bloated as a browser. And it's because one of the trickiest things for us, and it sounds ridiculous, was the rise of a Zynga game called Farmville. a casual game where you'd go, build crops and harvest them and trade them for money and stuff. And it's because Farmville is built in Flash, which is a plugin, not an extension, but Flash tended to leak memory. It tended to take down your whole browser. And because Farmville went from sort of 0 to 100 million people in the space of about a year, it was really hard for us to debug that, plus all the other extensions that people might have installed. I think we made it too easy to install extensions, and they were too unmanaged. And eventually that got fixed because it moved to more like a grease monkey model that Chrome has, it's less privileged and more managed, and that's what Firefox has now.
So Mozilla has the unique distinction of having been at its beginning against the Mozilla Internet Explorer monopoly, and now facing down the mobile web, Chrome, Safari, not monopoly, but hegemony, I guess, or oligopoly. How did you get over that hump of the entire web was dependent on Flash and ActiveX and OLE and COM controls back in the early 2000s? Were people dying to get away from that stuff, or did you have to overcome that as a significant barrier to adoption? Yeah,
it was an ongoing conversation. OLE and COM are the ones that were a big deal, just because it was easy to code an application, internal application in Visual Basic, and stick a COM control or OLE control in the web page. And most often happened in the name of security. So like Microsoft's their connection to the big banks was really good. So
Korean had actually legislated for ActiveX controls for banks.
That's true. Yeah, that's good times. Yeah, so like that, for that stuff, we just had to convince people that it wasn't any more secure. And in fact, it was a little bit scarier because you had closed source. But that was still at a time when it was not a widely held understanding that open source could create more secure systems, because people say, well, if you can, like the layman's view is, if you can read the source code, it must be easier to hack. And actually the converse is true in a bunch of crypto kind of ways. But so it was hard. I mean, we just had to keep going, and we had to believe in the web. Flash was contentious. We had a lot of conversations with Adobe about that, and as they started building their things that included Flash in the web. I can't remember what it was called. They had a future of Flash thing, and I don't know. We always felt like Flash was not the web and was not inspectable or codable in the same way. And so we just had to have a belief in the web. And so we just kept investing in developers and investing in the system, and then being kind of as steadfast as we could. I think that Mozilla didn't, it was Steve Jobs that killed Flash ultimately. Which is funny because Kevin Lynch, who ran Flash for Adobe at the time, now runs Apple Watch in Cupertino. But it was Steve's memo on thoughts on Flash that I think really put a nail in their coffin. But I think that it took a lot of pressure over a lot of time, and it's just there was no shortcuts.
How significant was kind of the standardization of JavaScript in ECMA and the standardization of HTML5 and CSS 1.0 and things like that in terms of driving a standard web which allowed you to compete more fairly against the likes of, and to create the accessible web. I remember accessibility being a huge argument for Mozilla back in 2005, 2006.
Yeah. This is one where there are people who are better than me to talk about this stuff. I was not super involved with ECMA. ECMA is, is like the creation of like HTML5, ECMAScript, and sort of the new JavaScript. What I would say is that I think that there is, movements to standardize things, and there are movements to add more functionality. And the web is always in both. It's got both motions going on. So one is like, how do we make it more standard so that you write once, run everywhere, which has always been the promise of the web, and it's not so much the reality. So to be standard, but also trying to keep up with platforms. And that was a time when, Windows and Mac were not super fast moving. I would say iOS and Android then would eventually come through this phase where they were super fast moving and very, very hard to keep up for anybody except for these principles. But I would say that the truth is, for most technology platforms, standardization does not lead functionality ever. It's really like who has the user base, with a desire to have more functionality, and who can go code that in a way that doesn't make everybody else throw up on it.
So I want to dig in there for a little bit. Standardization doesn't lead functionality, but presumably Mozilla invested in the standardization process for those technologies because they saw a benefit in it.
Sure.
What is the benefit of standardization in terms of, how do you justify that expense? Do you justify it purely in terms of this will make a better experience for our consumers? Or is there also if we don't get these standards in place, this will damage our adoption, will lead to us being marginalized?
It wasn't an adoption question. The Mozilla is not Firefox, and it took me like some time to figure this out. I first came in, I thought we should change the unknown name of Mozilla as the organization to Firefox, because Firefox is the thing in the brand that people all recognize. But if you really look at what Mozilla is even today, like, it's not the browser. Like Mozilla's view is that we're living. I mean, I think Mitchell would say the same thing now. Mitchell, the chair and the chairwoman and the CEO there now, and the founder. It was always like we're living more and more of our lives online, and it should be inclusive, and everybody should be able to have a say in what that technology looks like and what the experience looks like, not just wait till they get the Apple keynote once a year or Google Developer Days to be told what's going to happen. And so the browser obviously is. Mozilla always felt like the browser was the key front door to all this stuff for now. And Firefox market share was the best tool we had. Mitchell's point of view always has been that you get most of your power from adoption, from users using it, and not from just you don't get moral authority without having users, basically.
Right.
And so we had to have enough users who gave a damn about Firefox in order to be able to hold Apple and Microsoft and Google accountable in some ways. And if you think really about what we wanted was an open internet that was shaped by more than just these technology companies. And I think on the desktop that largely played out. I think on mobile, it's not at all as clear that's the arc we're on. These are closed platforms. None of these guys are quite as asleep at the wheel as Microsoft was with Internet Explorer.
Right.
And so we'll see. But the browser was never the point. The point was that we wanted an open internet.
But I think, and you certainly succeeded, right? You've got WebKit, so Safari, Chrome, Chromium. And I remember watching Tristan Nito, who was your European marketing head at one point, and sort of glibly saying, Internet Explorer 8 was Mozilla's best release ever, most successful release ever. Saying that, that was the point at which it was clear that Mozilla had really had a huge impact on the web, because everybody was moving to this more open, more secure. That was a sign that Microsoft had reinvested in the web.
Mm-hmm.
So are you done? Is the mission accomplished? What is the continued relevance of Microsoft today? Or not Microsoft, Mozilla, excuse me.
Yeah, I'm just a fan. Like I'm not involved anymore. I left the board in 2013. But I talked to Mitchell, and I'm a huge fan of hers, and I'm a huge fan of the people that have devoted their lives to it. I think that the browser, as you note, is not as important as it used to be. I think that there are people who wish it would be, and there are people who are trying to make it more important, as they should. But I live a lot of my life in apps on my phone too. And so I think the question, in my view, is like that they really should answer is like, what's the next arc look like for Mozilla over 5 or 10 years? It's a really robust organization economically. They've built a really the strongest market supported nonprofit that I know of in the world. It's an undertold story probably, but if you look at the relevance of the browser on making sure that people's lives are open, or the internet's open, I think it's on the wane. And so the question I think that Mitchell and the team are trying to figure out now is like, well, Firefox was a really good first act. What do we do now? And what's the unifying mission? And there's lots of one. I mean, my view is that there are huge and obvious Mozilla-shaped holes in the world right now. We really need Mozilla for user sovereignty, for privacy rights, for some pushback on surveillance capitalism, but also as a sort of a hymn to open creation, where permissionless innovation. And so I think they're working on all those things. I think that the trick is always like, what's the product that is the biggest leverage point? That's what they're working on, is my sense.
Well, it's been tough recently. Like Firefox OS never really got the traction that the organization hoped. So where is the next big opportunity? Is it in data sovereignty and privacy?
Well, I think that's one possibility. I think if you look at what Mozilla, if you kind of look at the breadcrumbs where Mozilla is now, they've got a lot of stuff around contests and ventures and open innovation and supporting people that are kind of playing around the edges of a lot of interesting different crypto, stuff like that. And so the question with data privacy and data sovereignty and stuff like that is whether normal humans care about it enough. Everyone gets worked up about the NSA or whatever spying on us, but then they'll also give I put my name and my address into the Starbucks app so I can get my free latte or whatever. So yeah, I think that, we all say we care about privacy, but in practice, we don't always act that way. Now, we may be going through a sea change on that stuff. And there are signs that is a possibility. But I think that the shape of the product is not totally clear to me. So, but I also think that Mozilla has always been really good at not assuming that the best ideas come from inside the building. And so if you create a community, if you kind of tend it and water it and feed it, that over time, like the game becomes like, how do you encourage innovation? And then how do you amplify and bubble up innovation that you see happening that's useful? And so I think that's where they are now. I think that Firefox is still used by tens to hundreds of millions of people a day. And so that they're not irrelevant, but they've got work to do to figure out how to be best.
So rounding the circle, following on from the point that you just made about privacy and people becoming increasingly aware of it, being in an election cycle again, people are increasingly aware of the issues around surveillance capitalism with Facebook and Google and Twitter. And we've seen this creation of centers of gravity of the web, where you can entirely live your life in 3 websites now, which is never the view that like Tim Berners-Lee had of the web back in the day. And that's created a situation where there's an opportunity for large technology vendors to essentially create a link between their web properties and the ways in which you access it. So Google applications working better on Android than they do on other platforms, or your iPhone working better with Safari or requiring Safari for certain applications, or whatever. Yeah. What is is Mozilla still an effective hedge against that kind of thing? And how dangerous do you see that kind of trend to the open web, the vision that Mozilla had originally?
Yeah, it's a problem. So I think there are no individual companies or organizations that can be effective hedges here. And I think that Tim Wu, a professor, wrote a book a little while ago called The Master Switch that's instructive and it's worth reading. And he talks about basically how technology always goes through three waves. The first wave is when you're in the garage and it's proprietary and it's closed. So you invent radio, you invent the light bulb or whatever. And then the second phase of technology is when it all kind of opens up. And so like the pieces get well understood and it becomes horizontally commoditized. And so like you've got a different plate, the wireless radio versus the screen versus whatever. And so the interfaces become standardized in between them. So you get this open phase where standardization really matters. And then in the third phase, everything closes down again around nodes of distribution. So how you get the software. And it's happened with radio and happened with TV, happened with newspapers. It's really happened with everything. And it's happened with the web, which is the web kind of started small and then it became very horizontal as people understood it, and that's closed down again around, as you know, Facebook and Google, by and large, Apple, ByteDance, and some others. And so the only thing that really breaks those is a new S-curve. The only thing that really breaks them is a new technology platform that is asymmetric and different and kind of attacks from the side. I think for a while, people really thought that was going to be VR or AR, and that might still, like, the Oculus Quest 2 from Facebook is a really big step forward. People thought maybe crypto was going to be the driver. The thing about these S-curves is it's really hard, and I think Andreessen talks about it in his essay. He said, look, crypto looks like the web did 20 years ago. They're really hard to predict because they really look like goofball offshoots that are not in the main part of the bullseye. And it's almost by definition. If it's in the main part of the bullseye, the big companies are going to be focused on it. And so I'd say that you almost need a new S-curve. What I would say, though, is that the big companies now, Apple and Google and Facebook in particular, and Microsoft as well, they understand this is what happens. And so they are more promiscuous with new technologies that look goofy than they ever have been before. And so they understand how this is how networks get disrupted and how nodes of distribution get disrupted. And so they're watching for it. And which just sort of ensures that it's going to be even more oddball a thing to come in and cut it. Right. So we'll just have to see. I mean, it could be that, something like, but then there's always curveballs. And so, nobody really could have predicted that Zoom was going to be a $150 billion market cap company until the pandemic happened. And so the world has a way of like changing starting conditions and changing assumptions about things. And I think that's real possible coming up. So we'll see.
So you mentioned earlier that like Mozilla has succeeded in creating a pretty huge nonprofit entity. One of the big drivers for that has been the revenue model, which I'm not sure everybody watching this. I'm assuming that most of the people who are going to watch this video are familiar with it. But can you go into how that happened? Like, how did it happen that you ended up happening on this, tens of millions of dollars per year revenue model from search referral?
Yeah, well, it's hundreds of millions now, so it's a big number. And again, it predated me. So the story that Mitchell will tell is that they got to some release of Firefox in 2004, and they're spending down this money that they had gotten from AOL, and they were trying to figure out like how to make ends meet. And then they had done a release, and then they went out to dinner to celebrate. And then it turns out that while they were gone at dinner, that Larry and Sergey, this is the story I heard, but Larry and Sergey came and knocked on the door. Larry and Sergey from Google, because they were big Firefox users, and they just wanted to talk to the team and say congratulations. And then there was nobody there. And so then the next day it happened again. And they started talking to Larry and Sergey a little bit. And they said, well, what do you need? And Mitchell said, well, we're about to run out of money. And Larry and Sergey said, oh, we can fix that. This is before Google went public. And so they put together a search deal, which is Firefox already had integrated search. And so we already had Google and search box as people wanted as the default. We already had Yahoo built in. And they said, well, we can just pay you a search referral fee for our traffic acquisition costs. And that was the genesis of the search deal. It was quickly generating millions of dollars a month in revenue, which was much, much more than anybody modeled. Just people really liked it. People really liked searching from the toolbar. And it coincided with the rise of Google as well. And so that's how it started. Over the years, Mozilla has gone around and done different deals, both in the U.S., whether it's Yahoo or Google, and in other geographies. So with Baidu and Rakuten and Yandex. And so just a number of deals around the world, mostly search. What it's meant is that the revenue model for Mozilla has always been very, very simple. We've only got a few checks a month from very, very large players, and very robust. And so it does mean that they're quite reliant on Google revenue now, which I think will get some renewed scrutiny given the Google antitrust stuff. But we'll see how it goes.
So in those early days, I remember you had Yahoo.jp was the search engine for Japan. Yahoo was more popular in Japan, Baidu in China, Yandex in Russia. Like the leading search has always been very much there's been one dominant search engine per geo. How difficult has that made renegotiating those search referral deals with, the likes of Google and Yandex?
Yeah, I mean, Mitchell did most of this stuff, and it was always like a little tricky because people say, well, we don't want to pay for cannibalizing our search. But the truth is there are very few levers that were as big as Firefox. And so it's true that defaults really do change behavior. So if you switch a default, like you definitely lose users.
But how big of a threat is it if you change the default to Yahoo or the Microsoft search and 8 out of 10 of your users switch it back to Google because that's what they prefer?
8 out of 10 won't. 8 out of 10 people never switch defaults. And so even if it's something where it's like synonymous with the term, like maybe you get 3 or 4 out of 10 switching, but it's still a huge dent. And really the truth is like it's very hard to find any lever on the internet that's worth 100 million users. There's almost none of them. And so it was a pretty big deal. So I think that, that was part of it. But the other part of it was like people understood, even very, very competitive companies understood that Mozilla in the large and Mitchell specifically was really just trying to make the world into a more equitable and fair place. And so it's hard to really play like massive hardball with an organization that really loved by users, really loved by regulators, and is trying to make the world the right way. There's some combination of that plus like raw self-interest that drove.
So I don't know if it's something that you attach a lot of importance to, but certainly the role of the Firefox trademark in the open source world, at least, a lot of people will remember the dispute between Mozilla and the Debian project and the creation of the Iceweasel fork of Firefox. And how important was it's been something of a theme in this process, in this series, that controlling your trademark as point of origin is one of the fundamental ways that you build value that you can then monetize in a business model, whether it's Red Hat monetizing Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or MongoDB being seen as Mongo being seen as the point of origin for MongoDB. How important was it for Firefox, the trademark, to be have a pretty strong protection in terms of its success?
So, well, when you say almost everyone will remember the dispute you guys had with Debian and
my audience,
it's almost maybe almost all of your friends will, but like I kind of forgot about it. So it's a very nerd specific topic. But what you notice, right, which is open source has always been great about copyright law and always been really mute about what to do about trademarks. And it's because it's a different form of law. Trademark was always for consumers. So it's like, how are you sure that when you go to the store and you buy a can of Coca-Cola on the shelf, it's real Coca-Cola? And so the government gives you the right to assert trademark to keep other people, so for consumer safety, basically consumer surety. And Mitchell, I don't know if people know this, like Mitchell is a lawyer, so she understood this stuff from the jump. And she understood that when people are going to be using this thing to get their internet and do their banking and their school and everything on, it had to be secure. And normal people, not server operators, not developers, normal people had to have faith that it was really actual Firefox. And so we were always strong trademark. And we took a lot of heat from that in the open source community. So people said, well, we're not free software in the Richard Stallman tradition or whatever, which was true. We were asserting rights and we were saying, you can do this, you can't do this, which some libertarians don't love. But we felt like it was requirement for consumers to be able to use to be useful to consumers at all. And so that was the right decision. It made people mad. So it meant they couldn't use the logo or the trademark or whatever, and we just had to take it. It was I don't think there was any question that it's the right thing to do. I think that it still probably makes people mad today.
I have to say, from a personal point of view, I've never seen any conflict between being free software and having strong trademark protections. I like you said, I see them as orthogonal. So I don't think that affects the freedom or not of the software.
Yeah. I think different people have different views on this, and I don't care what the term is. I just think as a practical matter, if I'm not sure what Firefox is, then I don't really want to use it.
Okay. So before we wrap up, I want to touch on your career in venture capital. One of the things when we were preparing for this, you mentioned is that you'd never been involved in an open source deal in venture capital.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk about some of the reasons why you personally have not gravitated towards VC investment in open source companies.
Yeah, well, so my investments at Greylock tended to be consumer, so Instagram, Tumblr, stuff like that, where open source is kind of immaterial, or they tended to be at the application layer for SaaS, so things like Figma and Quip. And for both of them, they'll use open source to get the outputs, but really the output is the web or the application itself. And my partner Jerry Chen did more open source stuff than I did because he was doing more infrastructure. And I think on the infrastructure side, it is pretty important that things are open source. I just think that it's horses for courses. You got to have the right horse for the right course. And like for me, it wasn't obvious that there were open source, that you needed open source to be successful in certain things. Now you'll see like things like Figma, like communities and networks and open communities are really critical in almost everything, and give you ways of distribution. But nobody cares about whether Figma itself is open source. They'll care about whether the file format is open source over time. They'll care about whether the APIs are open, and there'll be interesting and meaningful debates to have there.
Okay. So how much of a red flag would it be as a VC investor if the company was pitching creating their software supply chain from scratch versus using open source or investing in open source? Like how much do you look for companies that are saying, we build on Node.js and we have a committer there? Or is we have a committer there not something that's important at all?
Sometimes it's important, sometimes it's not. So I think you have to figure out for the right company. I mean, the biggest software IPO in history now was Snowflake, and Snowflake's all proprietary from scratch. And so if you said, well, if you're not like taking advantage of open source, it's going to make you go slower. Well, on that one, you were wrong. You lost a lot of money. Zoom, I think, is very, very, very low open source. It's almost all proprietary. But then there are huge companies that are open, like Elasticsearch and others that are WordPress, that are open source, like forever and ever. So I just think it depends. I think you've got to have, like everything, you've got to understand how the supply chain, your software supply chain, integrates with, sort of interacts with what you're trying to build in your consumer base and your distribution strategy and your monetization strategy. It's all got to kind of hang together, and every industry is a little different.
I think, and we've got a presentation coming up on this topic. I think one of the things that I've noticed is that companies who invest in open source as a way to commoditize their supply chain, kind of lower the cost of, getting new people who are skilled in using the frameworks they're using, things like React.js or what's the Envoy from Lyft or projects like that. Those projects tend to be, very successful, and there's not a huge business opportunity behind them, but there's a huge business opportunity behind what you build with them.
Yeah, that's a common pattern. But I would also say like successful ventures almost always, like, they're black swans. They almost never look like the thing before. And so reading too much about what's come before and what that implies about the shape of the company in the future, I think is kind of a sucker's game.
Okay. So it's kind of a survivor bias playing out, and where you look at the companies who are successful and you say that we got to be like them, but it's in fact,
that's what I think.
Companies that were like them failed as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're all smart. I can give you a pattern. I can say it's a constellation. Oh, it looks like a bear in the sky. Like,
okay. Well, thank you very much for joining me. I do want to give a shout out for our next show. We're going to be talking about, let's see, it's election day. And on November 3rd, we're going to have Alison. I should have been better prepared. Giannato, better known as Snipe, or Snipey Head from Twitter, and Roberto Galoppini, who are going to be talking about starting bootstrapped, self-funded companies and some of the things that go into that. And, they're smaller companies, but it's how does your role change going from an individual contributor to a CEO? What are the kind of business opportunities and revenue opportunities that are available for people who are starting a company around an open source project? And it's going to be an interesting conversation, so I'm looking forward to it. John, thank you very much for joining us today.
Of course, thanks.
And I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.